Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa once wrote, "Why is art beautiful? Because it is useless. Why is life ugly? Because it is all ends and purposes and intentions." The 1920s in the Soviet Union were a time of pressing ends, intense purposes, and vehement intentions. Building a new state out of the rubble of civil war and economic ruin, the Bolshevik Party demanded practicality and stressed rapid industrialization as a necessary part of erecting a socialist state, encouraging technology of mass production. A lot of avant-garde artists answered the call by embracing the factory and machine aesthetics, as well as working alongside engineers on creating objects for everyday use. And yet, many of their designs and architectural projects seem to not only undermine the urgency for industrialization, not only mock material scarcity of the early Soviet state. The 1920s design of constructivists seemed to defy the laws of physics. These were designs for flying bicycles and sprawling mobile towers and entire cities suspended in the air. These fantastic machines of the 1920s were never built to function. They forever remained as prototypes, as hypotheses, as models. And you can read this failure to be built as an artistic failure, right? Just an instance of utopian imagination of early socialists. You can read these works that way if you're lame and boring. If you're cool and interesting, like for example Professor Julia Vaingurt, you would be open to the idea that she outlines in her book Wonderlands of the Avant-Garde, Technology and Art in Russia of 1920s. The idea being that these perceived failures of the early avant-garde artists were not failures at all, but rather deliberate redefinitions of technology, not as tools for production, but as sites of wonder, lyricism, and aesthetic exploration. And in this video, we will explore these improbable constructivist technologies by attending to their historical and ideological context, by outlining theoretical and aesthetic frameworks that will best position us to approach these works as artworks, and then taking a closer look at three plainly coolest examples of imaginative technologies that were conceived as constructivist projects. And then we'll conclude by thinking about constructivism as part of a larger, timeless conversation about beauty and possibility in art. Because 1920s in the Soviet Union were a time of crisis and urgency, but it was also a time teeming with possibility. And technology, as a necessary part of the future state, provided both material means and metaphorical language for outlining of what is possible. And here's why. So, in 1920s, a new country is born under the banner of Marxist-Leninism. Marxism is an economic and political doctrine developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the middle of the 19th century. According to their projections, a communist society were to emerge in an industrially developed state. The problem is when Communist Party under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin takes power in Russia, the country is largely rural and very much industrially underdeveloped. So this Western doctrine of Marxism had to be adopted to the Soviet conditions. Enter Marxist-Leninism. And this will be important for our conversation later. So what is Marxist-Leninism in a nutshell? Let's dissect it. So what's the Marxist part? Marxist philosophical approach to reality combines Hegelian dialectic and Feuerbach's materialism. Hegelian dialectic proposes that all social development occurs through the conflict, tension, and resolution between thesis and antithesis. So thesis and antithesis exist in tension, they contradict each other. This tension with time is resolved into a synthesis. Then that synthesis becomes a thesis, acquires an antithesis, again this tension resolved into a synthesis. And through this continuous motion that is propelled forward by conflict and struggle, social development takes place. That's what Hegel says. Now the materialist part. Materialists assert primacy of material existence. The idea that matter determines consciousness, that material reality exists independent of your thoughts and feelings, and indeed conditions the way you think. So you know how Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," right? He believes that he exists because he thinks. Materialists would say, no, we think because we exist, right? So just flip the two. So that's the Marxist part. Where does Lenin come in? Vladimir Lenin, again, is trying to adopt Marxism to early Soviet conditions. And the conditions are not optimal. Lenin really quickly notices that an average Russian worker is a peasant who is illiterate and predominantly politically passive, which is a problem for a political movement that wants to achieve what is called dictatorship of the proletariat, right? You need to have a proletariat who would be the dictator, right? At the time of 1917 revolution, this proletarian class in Russian Empire is virtually non-existent. So what does Lenin do? Lenin insists on dominant role of the party as centralized decision-making institution that were to seize control and transform the masses from unorganized, elemental, spontaneous forces into organized builders of socialism endowed with class consciousness. In other words, faithful to the idea of dialectical struggle and the idea that matter determines consciousness, Marxist-Leninism cloaks the necessity to industrialize not only in material necessity, but also in the vision of emergence of a new modern subject through the connection between technological advancement, transformation of one's material surroundings, and emergence of a new human consciousness that would be endowed with class consciousness. In 1920, at the 8th Congress of the Soviets, Vladimir Lenin declares, "Communism is power of the Soviets plus electrification of the whole country." Bolsheviks loved a slogan. There are a lot of really cool posters by Latvian artist Gustav Klucis that kind of give this constructivist form to this idea of Lenin being at the very heart of electrification project, right, of distributing electricity across a largely rural, underdeveloped landmass. And the project of electrification was understood both literally as building electrical power plants and electrostations, but also symbolically as shedding light onto once dark corners of the Russian Empire. In other words, centrality of electrification and technological advancement signaled that Soviet Union must become a technologically savvy state, but also demonstrated that Bolsheviks thought of their project of building a socialist state as an Enlightenment project. There's this really cool poster from the 1920s that is dedicated to the theme of electrification as an Enlightenment project that has this huge red hand reaching into the frame holding a lit up light bulb. And under that hand, you can see representatives of old Tsarist institutions like military, church, bureaucratic institutions. And every single figure is trying to put out the light bulb by trying to blow it out or hose it down. And the idea, of course, there is that the modern Soviet subject understands how electricity works. It's all these backward, retrograde, imperial subjects that have no idea how to be modern. And say what you want about the Bolsheviks, but in under 10 years after taking power, electrical production almost tripled from its pre-war levels, and general literacy, roughly speaking, doubled. So this is all well and good, but what does that mean for our artists? Many avant-garde artists threw themselves into the service of the revolution, not only by creating propaganda posters, but also by designing clothes and textile designs, tea sets and furniture for workers' clubs. The idea there was that everything about this new world that the Bolsheviks were building had to be radically different from the world of pre-revolutionary Russia. Avant-garde artists intent on integrating art and life were drawn to technology as both mode and a product of active creation, right? A material way of engaging with the world. This is where I want to turn to Vaingurt's book. This is Vaingurt writing. Particularly appealing to these artists in technological creation was the principle of utility. And yet, their imaginative approaches to technology led them away from the conception of usefulness, narrowly understood as utilitarian mastery, conquest, and control, and toward a more complex idea reminiscent of the Greek Technē. In Aristotelian conception, Vaingurt explains, Technē, which is the etymological root of technology, constitutes a contemplation of a particular coming to be. Here's Vaingurt one more time. All art is concerned with the realm of coming to be, i.e., with the contriving and studying how something which is capable both of being and not being may come into existence. And this idea of Technē as integral in artistic creation is also something that German philosopher Martin Heidegger addresses in his article on technology. This is what Heidegger writes. There was a time when it was not technology alone that bore the name of Technē. Once, the revealing that brings forth truth into the splendor of radiant appearance was also called Technē. The poesis of the fine arts was also called Technē. The closer we come to the danger, the more brightly do the ways into the saving power begin to shine, and the more questioning we become. For questioning is the piety of thought. Questioning is the piety of thought. That's nice. Nevertheless, this is helpful because it helps us to depart from the compulsory association of technology with utility, and instead imagine technology, as our artists did, as a way of thinking that was not immediately productive, but rather contemplative, right? Maybe even intellectually pious, to use Heidegger's words. The argument of Vaingurt's book that I want to hold on to for the rest of the video can be summarized like this. This is Vaingurt. An exploratory character of Technē explodes any desire to be tethered to a single, unifying, overarching argument intended by the artist herself, the state, or any other totality to which she might aspire to belong. Imaginative technologies are not speculative in the sense that they are overly theoretical or risky or unsound, but in that they are driven by the desire to contemplate and explore. And this desire for exploration overpowers the will to power. In other words, Vaingurt says that imaginative technologies resist being pinned down by any fixed ideological framework or immediately instrumentalized by a given historical moment. Instead, she proposes, imaginative technologies respond to an intrinsically human propensity for curiosity and exploration. And in the works that we are about to take a look at, this drive for discovery and artistic play take precedence over desire to organize, control, and rule. So the first work to exemplify imaginative technologies is perhaps one of the most iconic works of constructivist art movement. It is, of course, Vladimir Tatlin's Monument to the Third International. As envisioned by Tatlin, the tower was to be larger than the Eiffel Tower, supplanting it as the symbol of modernity. It was planned as a skeletal, spiral structure made of iron that would house 3 glass geometric volumes, one on top of the other. Unlike the upright static Eiffel Tower, Tatlin's tower would embody the principle of dynamism. Unlike the Tower of Pisa, its lean would indicate the opposite of falling. Its diagonal structure suggested a thrust upward into the unknown, as if propelled into the sky by the movement of the planet itself. Its angle was to equal Earth's axial tilt. Moreover, each glassy structure was supposed to rotate at 3 different speeds. And I think this is the part that gets often overlooked when talking about the tower, is that the 3 volumes within the tower were meant to rotate around their axes at different speeds. So the lower cube, which was meant to hold conference halls and meeting rooms, would complete the rotation around its axis once a year. So it would move really slow. The middle pyramid that would hold executive offices would complete its rotation once a month. So it would move a little bit faster. And then the top cylinder that would hold telegraph and radio would complete its rotation once a year. So out of the 3, it would move the fastest. Perhaps the most honest and relatable reaction to Tatlin's tower was penned by Leon Trotsky. Trotsky hated this. Maybe hate is the wrong word, but Trotsky, who was Lenin's right-hand man militarily and who was an active participant in forging political and cultural program for the new state, writes this in his Literature and Revolution in 1923, writing about Tatlin's tower. He writes, okay, I cannot refrain from the question, what is it for? To be more exact, we would probably accept the cylinder in its rotating if it were combined with the simplicity and lightness of construction. That is, if the arrangements of its rotating did not depress the aim. So Trotsky is not always relatable, but he's very relatable there. And because he says, do we need the cylinder to be rotating? How does this contribute to our project of building socialism? How does this cumbersome architecture meet the aim, right? Meet the aim of building a communist future. So in this aim of building a socialist state and enlightening the masses, the tower fails. But was it ever trying to succeed according to that metric? Some have argued that the tower is a material representation of Leninist dialectical materialism, right? If you remember that spiral of Hegelian dialectic that we were looking at earlier, right? The sort of upward and forward movement through conflict. You can see that spiral embedded within Tatlin's project. And also, of course, the Leninist part, the centrality of the party, is reflected by Tatlin's placing executive offices and the radio, the telegraph, within that tower as a kind of being this dynamic engine-like backbone that allows this dialectical materialist unfolding of history to move forward with the party at its core. Some have argued that the tower was a representation of Lenin himself, right? Vladimir Lenin, who was sometimes referred to as the greatest screw within the collective machine. And these are all exciting readings, but all of these meanings are retroactively assigned to the tower. We know from archival research, and this is what Vaingurt shows, that at the moment of building his tower, Tatlin was hardly thinking about all the ways his creation can contribute to the building of the socialist state. This is what Vaingurt writes. When Tatlin began work on the sketches for his fantastic monument in 1919, the tower did not yet have a name. Monument to the Third International was by no means his first choice, but rather conceived as a way to secure a future for this improbable creation. By promising to house the members of the Third International, Tatlin was hoping to get funding for the materialization of his castle in the air. Of course, despite his functional official name, the lyrical unofficial name, Tatlin's Tower, alluding to its mythopoetic predecessor, the Tower of Babel, was widely used. And this is interesting. Like, what do you think about this connection between Tatlin's Tower, the monument to the Third International, and the Tower of Babel? Contemporary architects have tried building the monument to the Third International using contemporary architectural means, but seem to have failed to reconcile the inventiveness of Tatlin design with the reality of, well, physics. Right? They say that the tower cannot stand. It is almost as if it was never meant to be built. It is almost as if, instead of orienting its creation towards utilitarian, useful project of socialist building, Tatlin's Tower imagines itself as a part of timeless, idiosyncratic, natural world. Here's Vaingurt. The spiral structure of Tatlin's Tower reflects not only upon the trajectory of dialectical materialism, but also a shape often found in nature in general and in the human body in particular. A shape both aesthetic and utilitarian. Like the movement of planetary galaxies and the molecular structure of DNA, the shape of the spiderweb or the human ear. And there's a way to read Tatlin's departure from this serious call for industrialization as a kind of political gesture, right? One could be tempted to say, oh, Tatlin was trying to undermine the Bolshevik project from within by making these useless objects and mocking the socialist project. And again, it's a very boring and inaccurate and inconsequential argument. Thank God for life being more interesting than rigid political binaries. Tatlin's privileging the beautiful and the natural over the useful should not be read as him being some crypto counter-revolutionary, but rather as an instant of an artist responding to Bolsheviks' call for building of the new world and using technology as a springboard for artistic exploration, of trying to test the bounds of what is possible. Which brings us to the second useless machine. We will be staying with Tatlin for a little bit longer and looking at his Letatlin, which is Vladimir Tatlin's design for a flying bicycle. It was a prototype for a muscle-powered flying machine that was meant to gift the Soviet subject of the future the thrill of flight. One thing that always delights me in thinking about Letatlin is that its name is a pun. It's a combination of Russian word to fly, letat, and Tatlin's last name, Tatlin, right? So Letatlin is a combination of these two words. And it is just such a delightful and silly pun, and I don't know if it translates if you do not speak Russian. Like, I always try to think of a good English equivalent. It would be something like fly. Oh, what would it be? Like fly. Lionel Richie. Like Lionel Richie. Damn, I'm funny. Lionel Richie. Okay. And if you're one of those people that rolls their eyes at a pun, I just hope you find love in your life. You know, Pynchon said that there's high magic in low puns. And if that's true for Pynchon, it can be true for you too, okay? All right, so it sounds like a dig at the overly serious project of building of the new world. And Letatlin was Tatlin's last constructivist design. And like all technologies that we're looking at today, it remained forever a prototype, right? Letatlin never took off the ground. Tatlin designs and builds this prototype between 1929 and 1932, which is the transition period into the first five-year plan. Again, a time of almost militant industrialization. And against that backdrop, Tatlin makes a useless machine. But of course, much like Tatlin's tower, we can read Letatlin as participating in communist world building metaphorically, right, formally and aesthetically, much like his tower that can be seen as a material representation of Hegelian dialectic or a material representation of Lenin as metaphor. We can see Letatlin responding to this idea of an emergence of a new human being. It has been noted that in order to operate Letatlin successfully, one would need a kind of muscle mass that is almost impossible to achieve, right? And again, you can see it as a failure and as Tatlin's lack of knowledge of human physiology, but if you look at some of the objects that avant-garde artists are creating for everyday use, you can see how the things that were intended to be used in the everyday were anticipating a radically different user. Like if you were an alien and you were to land in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and you were to find Malevich's tea set and Tatlin's clothing design and Rodchenko's design for the interior of a workers' club, you would probably imagine someone with a square jaw and broader than usual shoulders and an overall angular frame, like Liam Neeson. That actually doesn't sound too bad. But this impossibility of physical engagement with these objects is not something Tatlin stumbles over, but he makes it as an artist. Here's what Tatlin says about his Letatlin. I don't want people to take this thing purely as something utilitarian. I have made it as an artist. Look at the bend of the wings. We believe them to be aesthetically perfect. And then he also says, birds are arranged more perfectly than airplanes. They are plastic in their construction, while airplanes are rigid. Birds have living, soft wings, while the airplanes have dead, rigid ones. Living, soft wings. That's nice. Tatlin lamented that the airplane has taken away the human ability to bodily enjoy the thrill of flight. He said that we get on an airplane like we do a bus, and then we just sit there passively trying to get from point A to point B. Where's the thrill of that? Where's this experience of oneness with the world around you? And Tatlin intended for his Letatlin to be a somewhat utilitarian object. Some say that Tatlin intended for the future Soviet workers to fold his Letatlin and just hang it in a coat closet after a long day. But of course, if you look at Letatlin closely, you know, we don't know the kind of size of a closet that would be able to house it, even fold it together. But then again, who knows, maybe the subject of the future would look so completely different that he would have these giant coats and maybe it would be able to accommodate Letatlin storage. And this idea of flight brings us to the third and final architectural and technological project that we'll be looking at today, which is Grigory Krutikov's design for a flying city. In 1928, architectural student Krutikov successfully defended his architectural diploma at the institution Vchutemas. His final portfolio included detailed architectural drawings of housing complexes suspended in the stratosphere. According to Krutikov's idea, the Earth in the world of the future would be relegated for factories, agricultural hubs, and government offices. But the living quarters would be located in the sky. The idea here again is that this new communist city would be radically different from everything that came before it. And Krutikov envisioned and designed three types of buildings. Let me see so I don't mess this up. Okay, so first, he designed a work commune, which consisted of 8 vertical 5-story high buildings that were united by a ring-like corpus. The living quarters would be located in those vertical towers, and all of the communal services, communal offices would be located within that ring. The second type of building was analogous, but a little more compact, where all living quarters were located in a single 8-story cylindrical block, and the communal services would be relegated to that sphere that's hanging at the bottom of the tower. And then finally, he designed a hotel, which was also in the form of a soaring cylinder, where living floors were organized around an elevator shaft. And you might ask, well, how on earth, pun intended, nothing is as good as Lionel Richie. I'm still laughing about it. Okay. But you might ask, how on earth would one get to this flying city? Krutikov thought of that too. He designed universal individual capsules that would be able to transport the workers of the future from the ground to these beautiful cityscapes. These capsules would be dynamic and malleable, and not only would they be able to fly, they would also be able to swim above and under water. These capsules could also serve as living quarters if necessary, because all the furniture within them would transform to meet the necessity of the moment, right? Like the chair would transform into a bed and so on and so forth. The individual capsules would attach to the flying city electromagnetically, while the city itself would be held up in the sky through the use of atomic power. To more practical questions from his committee, like, well, how are you going to get water up there, and how would you solve the necessity of having a sewage system? Krutikov reportedly bravely responded that by the time that these cities would be soaring high in the sky, the Soviet science will have already thought of solution to this hypothetical problem. And again, this is 1928. We're about to begin the first 5-year plan, and Krutikov successfully defends his architectural project for an impossible city, a useless design, materially useless design, at a state institution, right? Vchutemas was a state institution. Of course, his committee members knew and understood that Krutikov's idea was speculative and investigatory, as it seemingly disregarded urgent need for material utility and plunged into aesthetic exploration of technological possibility. Here's what Julia Vaingurt writes about these artists that engaged imaginative technologies, as she called them. She writes, "The primary motivation of these artists is curiosity and hypothesis, and as such, they stand in stark opposition to the socialist state and the art of socialist realism that preceded it. While the latter provided answers and fixed symbols, the former asked questions and engaged technology as a way of a metaphor." Vaingurt continues, "Paradoxically, it was the very hypothetical aspect of avant-garde uses of technology that made them so enduring." And indeed, if we look at some of the most exciting architectural projects of the 20th century, but also 21st century, we can see these echoes of improbable technologies as conceived by early constructivist artists, right? If we think of Frank Lloyd Wright's falling water building that is embedded into the landscape, or Litchfield's Snail House, which is practically an architectural pun, right? It's a house in the shape of a snail house. Or the dancing house in Prague that is continuously appearing as dynamic, right? As moving. Or the soft and hairy house in Japan, which is again a marvel of marrying architecture and natural surroundings. Here in Chicago, we have the Marina City complex, also called as corn cob buildings, which always remind me of Krutikov's Flying City. Marina City is also kind of suspended over the river and has that modular segment-like logic to the organization of its towers, which I find quite cool. There is a way in which we inhabit those impossible technological and architectural wonderlands. We only need to know how to look. And as far as technology goes, today, as we anxiously consider the possible roles technology can play in our daily lives with the rise of AI, self-driving cars, and all this good stuff. Perhaps thinking about technology in an imaginative, non-utilitarian way, in a way that reaches for beauty and aesthetic and artistic freedom and good faith creation. Perhaps thinking about that could refresh our perception and allow us to think about technology today in a slightly different and maybe even a little optimistic way. And that is all I have. Let me know down below what you think about this thesis. Which artwork was your favorite one? Have you seen them before? Did you learn anything new about their construction and their history? I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you so much for watching.